Okay, good day, everyone, and thank you, Mao Liosa, for the introduction. Thanks, Megan, and thanks to KT Canada for this opportunity. I also want to thank all the attendees of this presentation. Today's session is entitled Integrating Sex and Gender Consideration in Knowledge Translation. And as you read on the poster, the learning goal of the session are to recognize the importance of sex and gender consideration in health research and knowledge translation, or KT, to describe the different challenges and approaches to integrating sex and gender, and to identify resources, actually a list of resources that for in-depth understanding of sex and gender consideration. And here is an overview of what I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to tell a little bit how I got to sex and gender consideration in my work. And then I'll briefly talk about why sex and gender consideration matter. Then I will talk a little bit about my work in progress related to sex and gender in reported guidelines. Before that, I'm going to share a couple of definitions. And then I will provide a list of resources that's helping me. Before that, I will summarize the lesson I learned so far. So before we start, I will just want a quick poll. So I'm gonna ask Megan to pop up this question for you to just click on it, and we'll see what the participants stand for in terms of sex and gender consideration in health research. Okay.
So you let me know. We have about 80% of people responded right now.
Yeah, I think maybe in 10 seconds.
Sure, yeah.
We have 88%. I mean, people.
Oh, you can see it too. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Most of the participants are knowledgeable for the difference of sex and gender more than 3 years. Yeah, good. And I must say, to be honest, I'm in the third category, like because when I ask the question, it's knowing the difference, but also really maybe through some sort of a training or practice of sex and gender concept. And so I'm in the third category, so I'm young in this in the sense of sex and gender, but this is interesting. So I can move, yeah, we can close the poll now. What is this one? Okay, yeah. So we have the majority knowledgeable of this more than 3 years. That's good. So maybe now, Megan, you can close the poll.
Yes, it's closed. Can you still see it?
Yeah, I have to close on my end. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it should be out of your view now.
Yeah. But I can't move my slide. Okay, good. So first I want to tell you briefly how I got to sex and gender consideration in my work. I must say that all this started when I joined Dr. France Legare's team for my postdoc. At that time, she had been leading, among others, a project on sex and gender impacts on KT intervention. The project called Matrice in French. It stands for Application des connaissances axées sur le genre et le sexe des personnes en contexte francophone, or sex and gender-oriented knowledge translation in francophone context. So this project actually was funded as part of CIHR competition. This actually is the first competition organized by CIHR, Institutes of Gender and Health, to advance the knowledge on the integration of sex and gender into KT. And my experience actually from this environment had the three implications. The first one is that Dr. Frank Legare associated me with this project. And for that, I attended the meeting of the recipients of the team that were funded under this competition. There were 6 teams. And so at the end of the discussion, given the richness of discussion, the participants agreed that it might be interesting to produce a report that can be published. And I offered to lead that publication. So I will talk about this briefly in the next slide. The second implication was that this triggered one of my projects that I'm working on. This is a systematic review on sex and gender integration in reported guidelines. And then the third implication from this is actually my consideration of sex and gender in the my principal project, which is the development of a reported guideline for scaling up studies. So I'm come back on those points later. In addition, I need to mention that it was under the mentorship of Dr. Legare that we initiated the Université Laval chapter of the Institute of Gender and Health training network. So the training network, IGH training network, promote the integration of sex and gender. And there are a lot of chapters around across Canada from different universities. So I can move now to the outcome from that meeting from the 6 teams that were funded under that competition. And we were able to produce the report that was published last year, Sex and Gender Analysis in Knowledge Translation, Intervention, Challenges and Solutions. And so I want to thank all the participants of that meeting, also their participation in the process of the manuscript preparation and its publication, its submission and publication. So as mentioned, 6 teams were funded across Canada from different provinces and for a variety of projects, of KT projects. This include, for example, developing and testing educational materials or integrating sex and gender in existing educational material for continued professional development activities. I highlighted the team 5 because this is the team of Dr. Legare. And the project was mainly carried through a master program, a master student from Dr. Sarah, from Dr. Legaré conducted this study as part of a master program, and the results will be published soon. The title of the publication will be The Integration of Sex and Gender in a Continuing Professional Development Learning Activity on Diabetes and Depression. I also put a link at the bottom of this slide. It's a list where I'm compiling all the studies, the publication from the 6 team related to this competition. So you can check this out for updates if you want to see all the results of this project. But I can mention briefly that different challenges and solutions was summarized in this publication. For example, we mentioned difficulty of uniting around a common vision or a common language on sex and gender, and the difficulty of integrating concept of sex and gender into educational material for professional patients, and also, for example, the lack of usable disaggregated data in the literature, the fact that the sex, gender, and sex were used interchangeably. So these are a couple of challenges, and I invite you to check them out in the published paper. So briefly, why sex and gender consideration matter? I'll say the shortest answer to this is what is going right now. The COVID-19 pandemic. This is a perfect example of the different impact of sex and gender on health. If you see the tweet that I put at the top, for example, medicine is embedded with sex and gender differences, but it seemed that we needed a pandemic to let the world recognize it. So the COVID-19 show the different impact of sex and gender. Early in this pandemic, we had evidence that on how severe the disease was for male patients in terms of morbidity, that's the severity of the symptoms, in terms of hospitalization and death. But when we look at the gender lens, the differences between men and women, gender issues, how this affects the individual income, the parenthood, caregiving, housework, reproductive health services. There are striking and important difference between men and women, the burden of the disease for men and women. And if the CIHR has released a guidance for researchers who are conducting COVID-19 research on how they need to consider sex and gender in COVID-19 project. Even before the pandemic, with the growing recognition of the importance of sex and gender, there are a lot of publications out there. I showing just 2 examples in the domain of pain research and cardiovascular research. When if you see, you can see on the this infographic how different are the symptoms. There is a couple of symptoms that are common for men and women, but
we just lost your sound. Dr. Gogovor. It doesn't show you as muted, but we can't hear you. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, so now you're mute. Now you're muted. Now you're unmuted. I can't hear. I still can't hear you. I don't know if maybe you want to try. You could try logging out and in, or you could try calling in if your headset's not working with the computer.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, yep, now it's back on.
Okay,
Hooray.
thank you.
Sorry about that. Don't know what happened.
Yeah, I saw an indication on the microphone sign. I don't know why this happened, but okay. So I'm talking about how sex and gender matter in health research and knowledge translation. The paper published by Dr. Kara Tannenbaum and why sex and gender matter in implementation research and digital knowledge translation. And in fact, when it comes to KT, everything applies because we have the end of grant KT, we have integrated KT, we have KT as a research, so knowledge translation research. KT strategy may function differently and has different impact depending on the sex and gender identity of researchers, participants, and users. And if sex and gender are not considered, KT programs, KT activities can reproduce or even increase existing inequities. So now I'm gonna, I think I'm having an issue moving the slide. Okay. Now I'm gonna talk briefly about the two projects, my work in progress in relation to this topic. I will start by sharing some definition, of course, so that we are on the same page. So I pleased to see that most of the participants are already aware of sex and gender. It's a proof that at least the awareness among the researchers, the patient, the participant is working. So briefly, I like very well this infographic from CIHR, where you can, at a glance, see the definition and the illustration of the difference between sex and gender. Sex, which refer to biological attributes of humans and animals, including physical features, chromosome, gene expression, hormone anatomy, and sex usually categorized as male, female, but should not be binary because we know there are other categories such as intersex. And then gender, referring to socially constructed roles, behaviors, expression, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. So clearly this also is not a binary concept, a binary variable. And I want to say this, I like this statement from Dr. Paula Rochon. If you want to keep the difference, I quote, gender is not a polite way of saying sex, unquote. So this something that if you keep in mind to remember that these are two separate concepts. And you might also came across the concept sex slash gender. That is some authors brought this concept because when they want to actually show how it's difficult to disintegrate the impact of sex and gender. So some authors prefer using sex/gender. There is also, I want to share quickly, of course, the definition of knowledge translation is, I think most of participants are used to that, but there is also other concept that's present in my project, the implementation, the process of putting to use or integrating evidence-based intervention within a specific setting, and the scaling, which refer to effort to optimize the impact of those evidence-based intervention so that it benefit a larger population, larger setting. And the last definition I would like to share with you is the reporting guideline, defined as a checklist, a flow diagram, or explicit text to guide authors in reporting a specific type of research developed using explicit methodology. So integrating sex and gender in KT is a new field, and measuring the gap is the first step. The first work in progress that I want to share with you is a systematic review on integrating sex and gender consideration in reporting guideline. As we saw in the definition of reporting guidelines to help reduce waste in health research by addressing the deficiencies in the quality of its reporting. And of course, omission of sex and gender is one of the recurring deficiencies in research design and reporting. So the research question of this review is how sex as a biological attribute and gender as a socially constructed identity are integrated in reporting guidelines of health research. And the objective include assessing the integration of sex and gender in published reported guidelines based on the use of sex and gender related terms, and also to assess the correct use of those terms. The protocol of the review was registered with Prospero. This is the systematic review, and we're using the Prisma statement to report it. In terms of inclusion criteria, actually all the reporting guidelines listed on the Equator registry up to December 2018 were included. I need to mention briefly what is the Equator network for some of you. It's an international network created to improve the quality of publications by actually assisting in the development, dissemination, and implementation of reported guidelines. And the network actually maintain a collection of reported guidelines based on state-of-the-art search strategies and study selection. And they regularly run those strategy to update the list. In terms of data extraction, pair of reviewers independently extracted the data using a pre-tested extraction form. Information or data extracted include the characteristic of the reported guideline. We also extracted the use of sex and gender related word, sex, gender, male, female, etc. in the different sections of reported guideline. We use the electronic search for from the PDF document. And if the document is like an image, we use the optical character recognition tool to convert them into editable text. And for comparison, we also printed about 10% of the reporting guideline, where we counted the word, but manually, to see how the two mode of expression works. And specifically for the correct use of sex and gender, we used the definition based on 3 criteria. This is first used by Adiso and R. And I think this is the first time that using the combination of 3 criteria to assess the correct use of sex and gender. So the first of these criteria is a non-binary use. This is where the description of sex and gender implies more than 2 categories. So we rate it as a non-binary use, binary use, or unclear if there is not sufficient information to assess this. The second criterion is the use of appropriate categories. This is we look at if the author used for sex, for example, male, female, intersex, and for gender, man, woman, etc. So we rate it as appropriate use, non-appropriate use, unclear. And then the last criterion, the non-interchangeable use. This is when we look if there is a consistent use of sex to describe biological attributes and gender for social cultural attributes. And so we define correct use as yes if all the 3 criteria were met. In terms of analysis, we only use some descriptive statistics, reporting the numbers and percentages of reporting guidelines that use those terms in the different sections. Also the percentage of reporting guidelines that met each of those criteria for correct use. And we also use the trends in the use of sex and gender terms. So in total, we included 407 reported guidelines. They were published between 1995 and 2018. And as you can see, the year 2010 is the most prolific. I think that year we saw the publication of landmark reporting guidelines like consult and different extension, a lot of extension of consult and so on. So from that number, 39% mentioned sex or gender in the checklist abstract or main test. And if we focus specifically on checklist, the checklist is actually the most important section of a reporting guideline. This is what authors usually use because most of them, consult the other related document. And so in the checklist, if you look only at the reporting guideline that included checklist, only 14% mention or use the sex and only 11% use gender. In terms of the correct use of sex and gender, only one reporting guideline met the 3 criteria. This is the Sex and Gender Equity in Research Reporting Guideline. Actually, the only guideline that was developed specifically to report sex and gender information. And finally, when we look at the trend in the use of sex and gender term, gender has been used since 1996, while sex was used starting from 2003. But if you look at the definition that we just shared and we look into this, actually we realize that the gender term was used not to refer to the socially constructed attributes, but used for sex. So this an example of how the misuse of those concepts were present in the publication and even in the reported guideline. So in terms of discussion, actually we can mention how low use was sex and gender related word in reported guideline. And this finding is similar to what we found in previous studies. Actually, those studies were very recent because they were published between 2017 and last year. We assessed the presence of sex and gender related words, but it remained to determine the appropriate level of sex and gender information in reporting guidelines. There are some recommendations that I can share. I think the initial step for this is to address the issue of misuse, the confusion with the sex and gender concept, and the inappropriate use of those terms and their categories. And fortunately, reported guidelines are systematic review are regularly are subject to regular updates. So this is an opportunity for developers to address this issue. I also mentioned the Equator Network and its role in promoting, helping with the development, dissemination of reporting guidelines. So I think Equator Network also have a role to do to encourage developers to consider sex and gender in their reported guidelines. The second, so the manuscript of this paper will be submitted soon, and so stay tuned. The second project work in progress that I want to share with you is the development of reporting guideline for scaling studies. Succeed. The protocol was published last year. We saw that the necessity for evidence-based intervention to be scaled up so that it can benefit a larger population, larger setting. We also mentioned how it's important to adequately report the result of the health research. In the field of scaling up, our group conducted a systematic review and noted vast deficiencies in reporting this kind of studies. And at that time, there were no standard for reporting those kind of studies. So we registered with Equator Network to develop a reporting guideline for scaling up studies. The objective for developing scaling up studies, succeed for scaling up studies include establishing an executive committee to oversee the whole process of development, to identify relevant items, to prioritize the items, to pilot test the new guideline, and to disseminate it. The project is guided by the step recommended for developing health research reported guidelines. The project integrates patient-oriented research principles and sex and gender consideration. I will come back on that in the next slide. So methods used for this project include systematic review, consensus process, and also we're going to use quantitative and qualitative method for the pilot test. So the main point for this project, the point that I want to highlight is the consideration of sex and gender in this project. Actually, this is one of the first reporting guideline, process of development of reporting guideline that includes sex and gender consideration. If apart from the CIHR, so the sex and gender equity in research reporting guideline that I just mentioned. So we're considering sex and gender at all the steps of the development, the step of identification of the items. We ensure adequate representation of sexes in the panel expert group for the Delphi. In the consensus meeting, we will ensure presentation of disaggregated data. And in the new reported guideline that we will develop at the end of the process, we will include specific instruction on how to consider sex and gender at the different sessions in the manuscript writing of scaling studies. This is an international study project, and all the expertise needed are there. Expertise in systematic review, knowledge translation, development of reported guideline. We had 2 patient partners, experts in scaling up from Australia, and also experts in scaling up in low and middle income countries. And of course, we have an expert in sex and gender. So now we completing the systematic review that will be followed by the consensus meeting, the pilot set, and the dissemination. So based on my young experience in the science of sex and gender in KT, I summarize lesson learned to this figure. In summary, integrating sex and gender in health research and also improving the quality of reporting will produce better science because the results will be more accurate, more relevant, and better science will produce better KT with beneficial outcome and equity for the society, for the populations. So finally, to finish, I want to share with you a list of couple resources that helping me out. Of course, there are fantastic resources in Canada. CIHR has been one of the leading institutions in the development of the science of sex and gender. And so I think the first stopping point is the CIHR online training module, which is bilingual. You have also the Women Exchange Health Researcher Toolkit, the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health, bench to bedside. And at the level of government of Canada, there is the GBA Plus online module. That's the Gender-Based Analysis Plus. This is more like a policy oriented, but it might be interesting for some of you. And also a couple of book and textbook that helping me that I also want to share with you. And finally, I want to mention this ongoing project, the action plan to improve the definition, collection, and use of gender, sex, and sexual orientation data in Canadian electronic health record with the help of the Canada InfoWay Sex and Gender Working Group that I'm part of. And this project is led by a colleague from the University of Victoria. And I think you can, you'll have a copy of the site so you can see their contact if you want to get more information, to contact them or see the work that's being done by the Canada InfoWay Working Group on sex and gender. Because this is one of the ways to address the gap, the difficulty, the challenges that we just mentioned, the possibility to appropriately measure what needs to be measured. You need to have the information out there so that it can be used in KT intervention, because the type of KT intervention, the sex and gender of the participant, the type of summary that we need to use to produce educational material for clinician, for patient. We need to have specific information, specific data on those information. So I'm going to finish by thanking my mentors, the members of the executive committee of the Succeed project, and all the collaborators that helping in the project that I just presented. And I also want to thank the institutions and the funding agencies that are helping me and the team to carry out all those projects. So that is, thanks you for listening.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, Mo, do you have a question to start us off, Dr. Donald? And everyone else, please use the chat box if you would like to ask a question.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you for that presentation and leading us through your experience and how you've come to where you are now in terms of studying sex and gender and intersectionality with KT. So it was interesting when you presented the results of the review about the gap and the trends of the use of the terms gender and sex, and how you mentioned that gender was used quite early on, since or reflected as a trend since 1996 versus sex. And I know the work was done till 2018, I think, was the inclusion criteria. Do you feel that, you mentioned there's some newer research out there, that this is changing in terms of the trends in use? More so than the appropriate use, but just the trends in use. Do you think that's changing in the last, since 2018 till now, in the primary studies you're looking at? You see?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the graph I didn't show, we will say a steady increase in the use of those terms because of the review were based on assessing sex and gender integrating, but based on, we based this on the use of sex and gender related words. And we saw a timid increase, but it doesn't reflect on the correct use of the term yet. Everything's very recent, the reporting guideline that I just mentioned for sex and gender reporting was published in 2016. And it's, I would say, very timid. There is a lot of work to do to, I would say, to reach the mainstream, or so this is, I think, what I can say about that. But we're going to look at maybe the most recent publication and see if things are changing in the right direction.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, in the next 12 months, 2 years, and see how this is working, especially with the release of your information and the direction for those guidelines. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you.
Welcome.
Just checking the chat box here. I haven't seen any questions come in from the audience yet, so please feel free to use the chat box to send those in. If you think of something, we can wait another minute or so if people want to gather their thoughts.
Well, people are thinking about some questions. I do have another question. And it's around, and it's a little bit, you did touch on this near the end about policy and policy changes going forward. How do you envision some of your work moving into the policy setting or context, and how to move it forward in that realm?
Thank you, that's interesting. Actually, one of the channels that I can see, because as I mentioned, I was associated with Dr. Frank Legare's project Matrice, and we're working with the scientific director of the IGH, the Institute of Gender and Health, and to summarize the key messages, the key messages that come out of all the different projects. And I think this is a channel that I can envision that is more straightforward. They have the opportunity or the possibility to meet in larger group with government people. And this is, I think, a good channel to pass on that information. I personally do not have that much experience in terms of policy, but another point for that for us is to be able to establish, relationship with decision makers, and this takes time to build that relationship, so you can summarize the key messages from your research and to those who can make a difference in terms of policy. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, trying to summarize those points and move that knowledge forward into policy changes. Thank you. Megan, is there some comments or questions?
Yeah, so Anthony had a question in the chat box. So he said, I'm interested in the gaps in the review of reporting guidelines, but as someone who published an extension to Spirit last year, my work was focused on addressing gaps specific to the methodological issues of the extension, not general gaps in the parent guideline. And he said, I sent comments on such gaps to the lead author. So he has two questions related to this. He says, can you comment? First one is, can you comment on if you addressed or considered that? And the second part is, what do you think would be helpful regarding that issue?
So if you can restate the first question in the context that was laid out by the participant.
So do you want the whole first part again?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so his initial comment was, I'm interested in the gaps in the review of reporting guidelines.
Yes.
But as someone who published an extension to Spirit last year, my work was focused on addressing gaps specific to the methodological issues of the extension, not general gaps in the parent guideline.
Okay.
So he's wondering if you addressed that, or can you comment on if you considered that?
Well, what I can say that in the review, I don't know if I mentioned that, but when we consider reporting guideline, we consider all the reporting guidelines, including original or generic and extension. And the gap, so the gap that we found apply to extension as well as the general or generic reported guideline. So I think the message that we will try to pass as the result of this research is to reach the bodies or organizations that can disseminate this gap so that to make awareness among the developers of reporting guidelines, but also the users, because everyone needs to be aware of that. So I think I won't say pressure, but I think if I would say pressure, this need to come from everywhere. So all the channels are welcome to help in addressing this issue. I don't know if I answered the question as intended by the participant.
Okay. Well, thank you. We have another question from Stephanie in the chat. So Stephanie asks, who do you think might need to be the people advocating for sex and gender being included in KT? Do you think this might be the responsibility of those practicing KT to push for this, or something that researchers have to start reporting more regularly? Or better yet, do users of knowledge know that they need to contextualize results using a sex and gender lens?
Thank you. That's, I mean, the main point that we came out, and me, by attending the meeting of the participant, and also the time where I have the opportunity to be in meeting with the staff and scientific director from the CIHR. What came up is that it's not just something that need to be just for the KT. I mean, I want to say those who are doing KT, this is something that need to be addressed at any level. And that's why when we look at the different solutions for those challenges, some of them are not straightforward because, for example, I mentioned the issue of inadequate reporting of primary research, because when we want to summarize or do synthesis to produce KT tools, we run to difficulty to find disaggregated data or evidence, sex and gender evidence in primary clinical studies. So this is why I think I'm repeating myself, but I think all the stakeholders in the production of primary studies in their transformation into KT intervention. Everyone needs to be made aware of this gap. And I think we just at the beginning. I'm happy myself to find myself helping to or contributing to help address this issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gogovor. I'm just looking at the clock, and we're just coming up close to 11 o'clock my time in Western Canada, and obviously 1 o'clock in Eastern Canada. Again, thank you so much for the presentation and answering the questions. It's a large area of discussion and obviously a new and growing area. So thank you so much, Dr. Gogovor, for that presentation and grounding us in your research and your experiences. I'd like to also thank everyone for attending the presentation today and provide a reminder that please complete the online evaluation form for today's session. And please mark in your calendar for our next session for KT Canada's seminar series, and that will be Thursday, February 11th. And join us with Dr. Bridget Becon to talk on interprofessional collaborations. And again, have a good rest of the week, everyone. And thank you for joining. And thank you, Dr. Gogovor.
Thank you.
And a big thank you from my end as well, Dr. Gogovor, and to Dr. Donald for hosting today. Thank you, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.